Where do we find the meaning of life? Now, in answering that question, Jordan Peterson is a man with a foot in two worlds. He is a man of science. He's proficient in biology, the biological bases of psychology, developments of psychology as an applied science. At the same time, he's also the inheritor of one of the big challenges of the modern scientific world. And that's one that says quite bluntly that there's zero relationship between the factual orientation of our thinking and the value orientation in our thinking. And Peterson often seems to agree with that challenge, saying that we cannot define value in a physicalistic scientific framework. So, to put it quite crudely and frustratingly, how can we start with a bunch of atoms and have them bouncing around and see how that is going to give rise to the highest meaningful significance aspirations of the human spirit? It seems impossible. So that points him back to traditional myths, ancient myths. And since values and meaningfulness, those are essential to our human identity. And if it's true that the modern scientific project can't deliver on those things, then we need to go back to the pre-modern religions to find those. So Peterson also has another foot in the world of biblical interpretation, religious history more broadly, and he offers a narrative understanding of its myths. Now, Jordan Peterson also then frustrates thoughtful people here because his normally very clear language seems to start becoming more approximate, more metaphorical, and generally vaguer at this point. And, sometimes our reaction is just, well, anybody can make up stories, including ancient people who didn't know very much about science. So, all of these stories, and we can give them mythic interpretations, but where are the hard facts to back up those emotionally engaging tales? So it seems then that our problem is this. We've got a pair of trade-offs that we're up against. The scientific approach, it's factual, it's rigorous, but then it doesn't seem to be able to deliver meaningful values. At the same time, the religious approach, it's charged with all of this heated significance and valuation, but it is seemingly without a rational, hard scientific grounding. So what do we do then? Well, Peterson argues that Western civilization is built upon both, upon ancient Judeo-Christian insights and science, and that somehow those must be combined with the modern scientific insights integrated with the Judeo-Christian ones into a compelling package. So our project then is not to be either just wishful thinking, faithful, mystical, pre-modernist, religious types of people, nor to be coldly robotic, reductionistic, scientific people, but to find a synthesis. Now, to his credit, these are, the great minds have been grappling with the fact-value dichotomy for centuries, so Peterson adds a kind of modesty about his progress, saying, in effect, he's trying, it's an ongoing project. And even more interestingly about Peterson, he is complex because it's not just, of course, pre-modern religion and modernist science. He recognizes that the postmoderns, all of those cynics and outright nihilists in some cases, they are mounting a full frontal assault on both of the pillars of Western civilization. They're attacking religion and science, and Jordan Peterson is a moralist against those postmodernists because he believes that there are, in fact, objectively better and worse ways to live. So here's a partial assumption. So, individuality is strong in Peterson's philosophy. The cornerstone of Western morality, as he puts it, is, quote, the assumption that every individual is sacred, unquote. That's from his 1999 Maps of Meaning, page 261. I won't put all of the references in the podcast here, but I will list all the sources in the transcription. Secondly, aside from the individuality, every individual has agency rather than being merely a pawn of these overpowering forces out there. A third moral point, responsibility and taking responsibility. This is fundamental rather than embracing any sort of victimhood. Suffering is built into life, so toughness is essential, and social life too is complex. So we need honesty, and we have to cultivate listening. an openness to alternative views. Consequently, social fundamentals have to include civility and constructive debate. And while each of us should be striving to improve ourselves in the world, he also adds this is not just an unstructured grab bag of lists. There's a causal priority here. Quote, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. And that's from his 2018 book. Now, notice what we have here is individuality, agency, responsibility, suffering, toughness, honesty, listening, openness, civility, constructive debate, and so forth. Now, Peterson advocates these as genuine values, and that's all in contrast to the now widespread, it's all subjective kind of relativism. Sometimes it comes in more easygoing, casual forms, but it also comes in hardcore intellectual vergency. Consequently, Peterson is urgent about this project of finding some sort of workable synthesis before the forces of chaos prevail in our culture. But that urgency always forces us back for a deep thinker, and Peterson is a deep thinker, back to the hard questions about where we get value from. So, why do we make this deep assumption that science is factual but value empty, while religion is value filled but without factual basis? Where does that come from? Is it in fact true? What is Jordan Peterson's alternative to that? And does that alternative work? If it doesn't work and some sort of hard choice has to be made between a religious commitment and a scientific commitment, in his heart of hearts, where is Peterson ultimately going to come down? On the side of religion or on the side of science? Now, those are the questions, those four, that are going to structure the rest of this podcast discussion. Now, Jordan Peterson is swimming in deep water. The biggest names in philosophy and religion have thrashed out over the centuries major alternatives, and it seems like they've bequeathed to us a set of apparently quite strict options about the possible sources of value and meaning. So I want to quickly do an overview of those in order to position Jordan Peterson and ourselves in the flow of ideas. So if we go back to millennia ago, the Greeks and the Romans, or Greeks culturally, Romans politically, are culturally dominant, and early Christianity is, of course, rising and starting to be a contender as well. So the church father Tertullian, this is in the late 100s on into the early 200s in the Common Era, has a famous rhetorical question. What has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Now, Tertullian was stating the ancient world's big philosophical dualism. So Athens here is representing Greek philosophy, and Greek philosophy has a very marked tendency toward naturalism and rationality. Now, Jerusalem, by contrast, is representing the birthplace of the major Western religions, and they have a strong marked tendency toward supernaturalism and non-rational mystical faith types of epistemological bases. So what Tertullian's question is suggesting, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem, is that we face a hard either-or choice. And the problem is that whatever option we choose, we run into problems. And we saw this played out over the course of centuries. Now, the one set of problems became apparent during the medieval era. So Rome declines, 300s, 400s, definitely by the 500s, and Jerusalem wins the cultural battle. Christianity comes to dominance. It has a belief system that's full of ethical values and meaning and hope in a supernatural world beyond this one. But is it actually true? Is it rational? What about the natural world that seems to be so strongly devalued in that tradition? So 1,000 years later, Athens and Rome recur again, and with them we find again the rise of worldliness, humanism, and science, and the corresponding decline of religion. Faith is dissolved. More intellectuals become committed to reasoning all the way down to fundamentals and questioning even those fundamentals. So once we're into the early modern world, this grand sweep of history, the great debates of the 1600s and the 1700s over whether theology, that is to say our understanding of religion and the gods and the accounts that we give of both, should be based on revelation or on natural investigation. Is it revealed theology or natural theology? That is to say, say? Should we accept on faith certain supernaturalistically revealed truths and resist questioning them? Or should we be investigating the natural world rationally to find evidence in it of God's presence? Now, the early moderns increasingly are adopting the methods and the ethos of science. They set revealed theology aside, and they're seeking proof of the truths of religion. And they're using the powers of observation and reason. And to them, this seems like a religious project because God endowed us with the capacities for reason and observation. So we should use them. So each of us, as thinking human beings, should be actively seeking out and investigating the big arguments, pro and con, about God's existence. So that's the early modern world, 1600s on into the 1700s, but then the con side wins. And by the time we get to the Enlightenment of the 1700s, it became quite clear that arguing about God is a losing strategy for religion. So again, I just want to telegraph anachronistically that metaphor, but telegraph 4 generations of prominent thinkers who all reached the same conclusion from mid-1700s, late 1700s, early 1800s, mid-1800s, the biggest names in philosophy and religion, reaching the exact same conclusion. The arguments for the existence of God do not prove anything. Now, don't take my word for it on this. I have separate podcast episodes earlier about arguing religion. We take one of the strong arguments for the existence of God, strong arguments against the existence of God, and all of us should look at those arguments pro and con and reach our own conclusions. So I'm making a historical point here. David Hume, in the middle part of the 1700s, he's dissecting all of the major arguments for the existence of God and sets them aside. He argues and concludes that reason not only can't prove the existence of God, but really not much of anything. So what we should do is turn to natural feelings as our guide to life. Now, see here his dialogues concerning natural religion. Now, a generation later, Immanuel Kant, another giant name in philosophy and religion, he agrees that reasoning becomes snarled in conflict and contradiction if it tries to talk about God or an immortal soul or really anything about true reality. So the best that we can do is take on faith, some fundamental regulative ideas, in order to make sense of our apparent world. See his famous critique of pure reason, 1780, second edition, I think, was 1787. Now, a generation later, we're now into the early 1800s, another giant, Arthur Schopenhauer. He dismisses all of the arguments for the existence of God's order as a kind of fear-driven imposition upon this seethingly irrational reality. So reality is not benevolent God and order and all of that stuff. Rather, reality is a kind of chaos, and all this idea that we're going to believe in such a God with his rules for order and morality, that's just a subjective imposition because we're afraid to face reality as it really is. For that, see his world as will and representation. Now, jumping another generation again into the future, Soren Kierkegaard, he agrees that if you're a rational person, then atheism is a consequence of that. But the problem is that only some sort of religious commitment could really give meaning to life, so you have to make an irrational commitment to faith. So see, for example, his fear and trembling. Now, the point of this sidebar is that Hume and Kant and Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard, they are 4 intellectual giants, and for good reason. While 2 of them are atheists and 2 of them are theists, all 4 of them are agreeing that we cannot prove the existence of God or the truth of religion. Now, Jordan Peterson agrees with this. He agrees with the biggest names on this question. Quote, "The death of God in the modern world looks like an accomplished fact." Unquote. That's from Maps of Meaning. And he goes on to suggest 2 reasons for that. Quote, "Our constant cross-cultural interchanges and our capacity for critical reason have undermined our faith in the traditions of our forebears, perhaps for good reason." Unquote.
In his book, Entrepreneurial Living, 15 stories of innovation, risk, and achievement, and 1 story of abject failure, Professor Stephen Hicks has put together a series of interviews with entrepreneurs from 6 different countries and 7 US states to explore the adventure and the hard-headedness of business. In this book, Hicks explores what makes for entrepreneurial success and failure. To what extent does success depend on the key decisions, ideas, persistent action, or character traits? How does one's business life fit into one's overall life? And how does one even define success? Our belief is that we can always learn from the accomplishments and setbacks of others. The life stories from others can be informative, cautionary, and inspirational, as we each strive to more fully realize our own potentials and achieve our own goals. The 16 entrepreneurs featured in this book are widespread geographically as well as in the range of their endeavors, from sports to education, to fashion to technology, to finance to advertising, to architecture to cosmetics, and more. Observation of success and failure is often the best way to avoid pitfalls, learning from the mistakes of others to get on the pathway to success. This book doesn't disappoint, providing engaging and useful insights from the accounts of 16 entrepreneurs whose reflections are both personal to them and timeless in their significance for the rest of us. Pick up your copy of Entrepreneurial Living, 15 Stories of Innovation, Risk and Achievement, and 1 Story of Abject Failure by Stephen Hicks on Amazon.com. And while you're online, please leave a review for the Open College Podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. Now back to the podcast.
All right, so we moderns, however, we can't just go back to dogmatic faith. We have to recognize when our maps of reality fail, right? And Peterson is a modernist. He's a rational guy. He criticizes those who, quote, will go to almost any length to ensure that their protective cultural stories remain intact, unquote. So, death of God, we have all these traditional cultural stories based on religion. Those are dead. They are failures. That's an accomplished fact, and that's Peterson's starting point. So he's right up to speed then on what the biggest names in philosophy of religion in the middle part of the modern world have concluded. So now we're back to the original question. Where are we going to get the meaning of life from then? Do we have to agree with Fyodor Dostoevsky, his line of if God is dead, then everything is permitted? That is to say, we don't really have any true values or objective values or universal values. Now that line from Dostoevsky is put in the mouth of one of his characters in Brothers Karamazov. But the problem then is going to be, if God is dead, we can't actually live nihilistically. Intellectually, however, we seem pushed toward some sort of emptiness and nihilism. So if the big brains of philosophy and religion are correct, religion has failed us because humans do need order, principles, and purpose, but those can't, for us, come from these ungrounded, wishful thinking stories from the ancients. Now, the problem then gets worse because scientific materialism simultaneously doesn't seem to be able to fill the value void that it has created. And that's the major weakness of the Enlightenment project. Science might try to replace religion, but science is about facts, and facts are merely brute descriptions of what reality is. So Jordan Peterson accepts another deep point in early modern philosophy, that the standard negative answer to philosophy's so-called is-ought problem. Quote from Peterson, "It is not possible to derive an ought from an is. This is the naturalistic fallacy of David Hume." That's from Peterson's Maps of Meaning. So there is a gulf in Peter's thinking between facts and values. We need values, but, quote, science cannot provide that belief, unquote. So back again to the modern predicament. We find it very hard to believe in these supernatural religious sources, and we do believe that naturalistic science can't provide values. Consequently, for many of us, quotation from Peterson, gaping holes remain in our spirits, unquote. And neither religion nor science can fill those gaping holes in our spirits. Now, to his great credit, Peterson is fully cognizant of the problem. Further to his credit, he is actively wrestling with it and not in any sort of bad faith way avoiding it, as we know many people do. All right. What about, though, pragmatic religion? Pragmatism, neo-pragmatism, sometimes that label gets assigned to Peterson, and I think there's very good reason for that. The next intellectual development after the death of God, the failure of natural theology to prove the existence of God, the apparent conclusion that if we are rational, then we have to become atheistic and scientific, but then in a value kind of void. So the next intellectual development, thus, is going to be religion's pragmatic turn by the time we get to the middle part of the 1800s. And Jordan Peterson's language is frequently, explicitly, and very often implicitly pragmatic. Now, what is pragmatism? Well, pragmatism basically says, by their deeds shall ye know them. So what we should do is not concern ourselves too much with debates over theoretical truth and semantics. The real question for pragmatism is, what difference will it, whatever it is we're considering, wanting to believe, what difference will it make in action? And what are the consequences of those actions going to be? The issue of an idea is not so much its truth, but how is that idea going to be operationalized? And will the operation work? So to take a kind of workman-like example, suppose I've got some tool in my hand and I can ask the question, is this a hammer or is it a mallet? But, I shouldn't spend a whole lot of time worried about semantic distinctions between hammers and mallets and getting into arguments about with other people about the borderlines between the two of them. The important question here is, can I whack something successfully with this? It's a tool. And it doesn't matter what the definition of the tool is, what the theory of the tool is, but rather what can I do with it, and can I do something successful with it? So to return then to the case of religious doctrinal schisms and all of the endless wrangling over definitions and all of these fine lines that set people at each other's throats between orthodoxy and heresy. All of that's just a waste of time, says pragmatism. And we've got millennia of futile arguing that shows that. Our pragmatic question should not be about religion. Is religion true? Rather, the question is, does religion work? Right? How is it operationalized? How can we use it? What kind of tool is religion? Truth, let's set those issues aside. So thus we have the rise of the many functional interpretations of religion. And this is a tradition that runs through Alexis de Tocqueville, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Sigmund Freud. So I'm going to be picking up just a little flavor here of some pragmatic takes on religion from the middle 1800s on through the early 20th century. Freud, of course, is not only a philosopher and cultural critic, he is one of the founders of modern psychology, and we know Peterson as a psychologist is deeply read in this territory here. But this just quick taste of some pragmatic interpretations of religion. So Alexis de Tocqueville, this is in his big book, Democracy in America. He argues that, while religion is unfounded intellectually, it is practically necessary, especially for the active Americans he's studying. The active Americans are out there building a new country. Not only are people way too busy making a living to think, to spend a lot of time thinking about religion and investigating. Religion itself is very hard and it's confusing. So, quoting from Tocqueville, studies of this nature are far above the average capacity of men. And even if the majority of mankind were capable of such pursuits, it is evident that the leisure to cultivate them would still be wanting. That's the end of the quote. So, if we encourage everyone to think about everything, then Tocqueville's point is we're only going to paralyze them with doubt. And that's just going to prepare them for servility rather than free living. So what we intellectual types, what we leader types should be doing is benevolently encouraging religious belief among the population, even if we are not believers ourselves. Again, a quotation from Tocqueville. While it must be religion that if it does not save men in another world, the it being religion, it is at least very conducive to their happiness and their greatness in this, that is to say, this world. That's the end of the quotation. So The point is, religion is not true, but it is socially useful, and that's the pragmatism. So a decade later, Karl Marx famously argued that religion is made up. Quote, "Man makes religion. Religion does not make man." Unquote. And it's very useful in social domination, power politics. So the rich, according to Marx, are becoming rich by exploiting and immiserating the poorer masses. But at the same time, the rich throw out all of these religious dicta like, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. But notice that those sorts of formulations, they are functioning as a psychic, quote, opium of the people, unquote. And so this opium, this drug, keeps the masses passively accepting of their exploited, alienated, immiserated state. Now, Marx disapproves of religion. He sees it as malevolently motivated, as a tool of power, a tool of control. But the point he's making is that he agrees entirely that its truth or falsity is irrelevant. It's the functionality of religion that is critical, and that's the pragmatic move. For more, you can see his critique of Hegel's philosophy of law. Jumping another religion to another big name, Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche argues that religion is false, but very functional. But it's not unlike Marx. It's not imposed from the outside by the powers that be. Rather, it is self-imposed. We do it to ourselves. And here Nietzsche's analysis is that all of us, we want to be powerful. We want to be able to assert our will, to assert our power over the over the world, to assert it over other people. But most of us are kind of pathetic. We're weaklings, and we know that we are really pathetic weaklings. So a lot of our desire for power gets internalized, and out of frustration and envy, we start to construct these fantasy worlds. And these fantasy worlds console us about a life after death when maybe things will be better for me, but they also give us an imaginary revenge over our more powerful betters. God's going to get them and send them to hell, and so forth. So Nietzsche here invites us to enter into the psychological world of the Judeo-Christians during their formative era. So if we go back in history to the earliest Jews and the earliest Christians, and what do we find? Well, they're both slaves, and they're oppressed, and they're in terrible circumstances. So the Jews were slaves under the Egyptians for a while, and the Christians were oppressed under the Romans. So imagine, though, how that miserable state of slavery and oppression is going to become a kind of psychological workshop for the creation of what Nietzsche calls this slave morality. The meek shall inherit the earth. Well, that's just a self-delusional consolation. But the point is not, is it true that the meek are going to inherit the earth? The issue is its usefulness, and it performs a psychological function for a certain kind of person, even if Nietzsche despises the type of person who uses religion. So for more, see his genealogy of morals. Now, again, just to jump another generation on this pragmatic twist in religion, now we're into the early 20th century, Sigmund Freud. Yeah, he also is not a believer. He argues that religion is, this is a quotation now, so patently infantile, so foreign to reality, that to anyone with a friendly attitude toward humanity, it is painful to think that the great majority of mortals will never be able to rise above this view of life. Now, this is from his Civilization and Its Discontents. But notice what he's saying is religion is pathetic, it's not true, but the fact is that most people aren't going to be able to get beyond religion. Now, he then goes on to argue a psychologically functional interpretation of it. And he starts from childhood. When we're kids, when we're infants, we do need a father figure to protect, to provide, to guide us. But then we're supposed to grow up. However, most people never do grow up. They never mature enough to dispense with some sort of father figure. Another quote, "The origin of the religious attitude can be traced back in clear outlines as far as the feeling of infantile helpless. And then Freud goes on to argue that life is so intensely disappointing and frustrating that we need crutches, we need palliatives, we need things to help us get through the day. Now, some of us turn to drink and drugs, other of us, we divert ourselves with artistic creations and fantasy worlds there, or we go into the lab and become scientists with all things, nice, neat, and orderly, and so on. But Freud goes on to argue, look, drugs are self-destructive. And frankly, most people are not creative or smart enough to become artists or scientists. So we do need a simpler option for most people. And that's exactly what religion does. So Freud goes on, strong atheist that he is, he goes on to argue that we should advise most people to be religious and urge them to use religion really as a kind of crutch. Now, all four of these figures, Tocqueville, Freud, Marx, Nietzsche, are atheists. They're all religious unbelievers, but two of them are endorsing religion on pragmatic grounds, and two of them are rejecting religion, but also on pragmatic grounds. Now, this is exactly, this pragmatism, the territory that Jordan Peterson is working. Often when Peterson is asked directly about religious beliefs, people trying to put him on the spot or pin him down, do you believe in God? Peterson's response is to say, direct quote, I act as if God exists. Now, traditional theists don't like that answer, and traditional atheists don't like that answer either. That's because both of them, the traditional theists and the traditional atheists, are focusing on the question of religion's truth. But what Peterson is signaling with that kind of answer is that the important thing is action. I act as if God exists. As a psychologist and as a social theorist, his focus is upon religious belief as a personally and socially useful tool.
Friedrich Nietzsche was famous for his statement that God is dead, and his provocative account of master and slave moralities, and also for the fact that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis claim that Nietzsche was one of their great inspirations. Were the Nazis right to do so? Or did they misappropriate Nietzsche's philosophy? Professor Stephen Hicks's concisely written book, Nietzsche and the Nazis, based on the 2006 documentary, corrects many widespread misconceptions about Nietzsche, giving a fascinating and easy-to-understand analysis of Nietzsche's work, asking and answering a number of questions, such as what were the key elements of Hitler and the National Socialist political philosophy? How did the Nazis come to power in a nation as educated and civilized as Germany? What was Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy? The philosophy of live dangerously, and that which does not kill us makes us stronger? And to what extent did Nietzsche's philosophy provide a foundation for the horrors perpetrated by the Nazis? Professor Hicks demonstrates his mastery of this subject using quotes and critical analysis that prove his points and show the true linkage between Nietzsche and the Nazis, and how philosophical ideas move the world. Get your copy of Nietzsche and the Nazis by Stephen Hicks on Amazon.com today. And while you're online, please leave a review for the Open College podcast hosted by Hicks himself on iTunes or Stitcher. Now back to the podcast.
Now, if we go back to his first big book, Maps of Meaning, Peterson explains myths as explanations of the world, but with kind of normative significance, normative salience added to them. Science might say there's no intrinsic goal, the world is not going anywhere, it doesn't have values, it doesn't have purposes, so there's no intrinsic goal or telos out there in the world. But the myths that we respond to as human beings, they are accounts of our world and our place in it. So myths are not just these abstracted descriptions of the world like the ones that science tries to provide to us. Myths are not either just theories about the world that are divorced from action. Rather, myths are value-laden and they are in relation to us. We humans, we have goals. We understand the world, therefore, in relation to our goals, our ambitions, our need to form plans, to make commitments, to overcome obstacles, and so on. Myths capture this in these value-rich narratives. Science is not going to say that the world is a drama, right, with a plot leading to a climax, right, and an eventual result, and good and bad built into it. So it's the difference then between saying that the world itself is a drama and that say that what we are doing is constructing a drama of ourselves in the world. So when we're looking at these myths, ancient myths, religious myths, and so forth, the right question to ask of the myths is not, is it true? The right question is it relevant? The question is not, is the myth factual? The question is it workable? And that's Peterson's pragmatic take on myths. Now, of course, any one of us might be born into a mythic structure, into a society in which one set of myths is predominant, and we might accept it on faith initially. Quote from Peterson, "Belief has to be grounded in faith," end of quote. Yet as we become more educated and more mature individuals, particularly in the modern world, we learn that there are many, many religious myths and dramas out there, including those of the ancients, and we also learn that they've been subject to evolutionary forces and that they've changed over time. So, while our individual commitment to any one of these myths, it might start as an act of faith, depending on the accidents of your social birth, our commitments to these myths do not remain an act of faith. As we become more mature and aware of the alternatives and the changes and even the problems, none of the traditional religions is fully satisfactory. So we, as the inheritors, we do need, in turn, to critically assess them. We need to be committed to the project of trying to improve them. So here, intellectual responsibility means that we have to adapt the ethos of science's method, this free investigation and debate, and apply it to religious myths. And so this ongoing sorting of the wheat from the chaff, the remixing, additions to myth, that is how we make progress as human beings. So note what Peterson is saying here, right? The construction and the reconstruction of the myths. It's about us and our values in a world that itself has no values. Myths are not scientifically true, but they are practically essential to us individually and socially. Here's a quotation from Peterson, 1999, Myths of Meaning, quote, "Narrative description of archetypical behavior patterns and representational schemas, myths, appears as an essential precondition for social construction and subsequent regulation of complexly civilized individual presumption, action, and desire," end quote. All right, now if we take that long description there and we insist upon the "is it true" question of these myths, then Peterson suggests once again, truth is not quite the right question here. Rather, it's by their practical fruits that we shall know them. Right? And then Peterson goes on, this is another quote from Maps of Meaning, kind of evaluating the usefulness of religion. Quote, "Traditional societies predicated on religious notions have survived, essentially unchanged in some cases, for tens of thousands of years," end quote. That's to say, it's their pragmatic survival value. That's perhaps the better factor Peterson wants us to focus upon. Now, how do we properly evaluate pragmatism? It seems like there's some philosopher puzzles here. Can we ask whether pragmatism is true? Right? Because it seems to disavow truth. So does that then mean that we have to use its own criterion of workability self-referentially, and that the only question we can ask about pragmatism is whether pragmatism works, is it functional, and so on. Now at this point I want to transition from exposition of Peterson's views and putting them in the context of kind of big picture philosophy and religious debate. So I want to critique and raise some challenging questions for pragmatic religious accounts, including Jordan Peterson's. So, suppose we are going to be pragmatic about religion. How will we determine if a religion works? Peterson has sometimes suggested, as in this previous longevity quote, that longevity might be a criterion. If it's worked for a long time, that's some indication that it's functional and therefore has a lot going for it. So the quotation was, traditional societies predicated on religious notions have survived, in some cases, for tens of thousands of years. But this longevity criterion, that doesn't seem to indicate workability, because we do know lots of useless things can last a long time. So the fact that it's hanging around for a long time doesn't necessarily mean that it's still useful. And still it seems that questions about truth and goodness persist of things that have lasted for a long time. So we always find ourselves asking of long-held beliefs and practices whether they are in fact good or true, because there's lots of superstitions that seem ridiculous, lots of traditions that we find morally repugnant, even though they've been around for a long time. Also, it does seem if we push too hard, and maybe not even very hard, on long-term survival as the criterion of workability, then that seems to point us in the direction of a kind of stagnant conservatism as the ideal. We shouldn't be questioning things that have stood the test for a long period of time. We should be conservatives, but then that's going to mean we're never going to valorize innovation and progress. So we might be flirting with setting up for a very hidebound conservatism if we push too hard on that criterion. At the same time, just again focusing on longevity, we then would have a difficult project of choosing between the many religious belief systems that have now lasted a very long time. There are quite a few diverse contenders, Judaism and Christianity and Islam, Buddhism and Shinto and Hinduism and so forth. So there's lots of diverse contenders, those that have been around for a long, long time, and they contradict each other. And it still seems like it's a reasonable question or a reasonable hypothesis to say of any of those religious traditions that they would have survived better, or they would have worked better if they'd had some or maybe even a significant number of different beliefs. So all of those kinds of questions seem to point to a criterion of workability outside of just long-term survivability. And Peterson himself does seem to indicate his agreement frequently that he's being open to religious evolution. Now, if we grant, though, this is a second thought here, that early religious maps and myths do need some editing and they do need some updating. So how are we going to decide which of the elements in the package that we're going to drop or revise? Suppose we want to say, all right, we've got this religious system, all these religious scriptures, and they've got hundreds or thousands of elements in them that make up the myth. And what we want to do is we want to take this scripture and decide, and we want to produce an updated kind of good stuff only version of it. Now, the standard then has to be that we're going to make these editorial choices. The standard has to come from outside the religious scripture. And here's where Jordan Peterson's evolutionism, his scientific side, comes out. So then we can ask of any given element of Scripture, does it still have survival value? If not, we might drop it. If it does, then we will continue. So it's not the fact that it's in Scripture that we are using as saying, therefore, and it's been in Scripture for a long time, therefore we're going to keep it. Rather, we're going to take that Scripture and apply it to the current practical survival value question outside of Scripture. That's how we're going to evaluate. So if we're not faithfully beholden to the text, then we will put every element of the text, every element of the script, each component myth on the chopping block potentially, and ask whether it's working in the actual current physical world. And I think this is the direction that Peterson wants us to go. And this is going to, of course, cause huge pragmatic problems when we're trying to have conversations with people who are not pragmatic about their religion. Now, that's religions in general. Now, I wanted to ask a more closely related question about Christianity in particular, since that's the religious tradition that Peterson endorses and from which he draws most of his examples. But suppose we start philosophically as a pragmatist, and we're committed to a kind of Petersonian pragmatic workability of myths criterion. Then why is Christianity special? And maybe Christianity is not going to be special. That is to say, couldn't Islam or Judaism or Buddhism or Hinduism do just as well as providing a mythic narrative for people? Why is Christianity better? All of those, arguably, have worked for lots of people for lots of time. And we don't want to just start counting heads. How many people believe in the religion? Whichever religion has the largest adherents, that's the one that's the most workable, or the one that's been around for the longest period of time. That's the most workable. All of them have worked arguably for lots of people for lots of time, and that doesn't seem to be helpful. And so the general logic, though, of Peterson's pragmatism seems to be that, any religion is more or less workable, so anyone is going to get the job done. But if you are going to argue that, in fact, one of those religions does work better, then we're into a very huge project here. That's a huge amount of hard comparative work that we would have to commit to. And then the question is going to be, how many people are actually going to do that hard comparative work? And even if we do say we're going to commit to that hard comparative work, I'm an intellectually ambitious, so I want to get the religion that works the best. In the meantime, should we be adopting an agnostic approach? I'm not actually going to believe in any of them until I figure out which one actually works the best. Or is it the case that, even by the time we get to this stage in our intellectual development, you're an adult, and at that time, you're pretty much likely acculturated to one of those religions, so you might as well, stick with that one and work within that one. That's a whole bunch of questions about, evaluating the pragmatic workability of Christianity in particular. And the question is going to be, of all of those questions, if we are pragmatic about our religion, how on earth are we going to choose between all of those options and those methodological procedures on pragmatic grounds? Now, another related question about religions, Christianity in particular, but then other kinds of myths and narrative structures as well. So if we want to follow this Petersonian line and say religions are mythic narratives with built-in value richness, and they serve our psychological and social needs. The question is going to be, does a narrative even have to be religious in order to perform those functions? We need things that are value-rich, serving our psychological and social needs, right, and our narrative. But what about movies and literature, for example? They do much the same thing. Jordan Peterson recognizes this, of course. But if we look at the structures of movies and literature, they've got goal-directed action, they've got plot lines, good and bad character types, symbols, tropes, moral of the story themes. And we're all perfectly fine with giving functionalist interpretations of what movies and literature do for us. We're not too concerned about whether a story is true if it's a work of literature. What we're looking for is something that's coherent, that's meaning generating, that's inspiring. We want narratives to fit that for us. So why not literature as a set of narratives that pushes all of our psychological buttons and provides functional, pragmatic value for us? And we can say the same thing about sports. Sports have constitutive rules of order. They've got goal-directed behaviors. They've got all these inspiring role models and these despised characters. Many narratives that all of us construct about the players and if we're players and fans, about the sporting life. So there's a very rich narrative psychological framework and social framework that sports can provide as well. So does it really matter which form or genre of narrative we commit to? Why not religion? Well, why not movies? Why not literature? Why not sports? Can believing in James Bond, the action hero spy, what that does for me psychologically? Can that work just as well as, say, believing in Muhammad? Or if a person worships Pele, the soccer star, or worships Jesus Christ, is it the same in terms of psychological functionality? Along with, just to make a little joke here, many of our fellow Canadians, Jordan Peterson and I, could join them and say, hey, hockey is our religion. Because, hockey is complete with social rituals, and many of us have personal shrines in our homes. We've got the displays of pennants, jerseys that we've acquired with the star players' names on them, photos of the championship teams from the glory days, and so on. Does not hockey we joke about hockey as a religion, but functionally and socially, it seems to be performing pretty much the same function. So why is religion going to be any better than, say, hockey or any other sport? Now, if we are going to object to equating religion with movies or sports, the grounds, we know that movies aren't real. Sports is just made up rules. So they're not strong enough narratives to satisfy our psychological and our social needs fully. Well, what that means for pragmatism is that in addition to the functional value, we actually need to believe that it's really real, that it's really true in some sense for a narrative to work fully. If we're going to say movies won't work fully because we know they're just made up, and the same thing about sports. Now, if we go down that road, then what that means is that pragmatism is incomplete. Now, I want to make just one final comment, and I want to return to Jordan Peterson's statement when he's pressed about whether he really believes, and he says, I act as if God exists. Now, drill down to an example. Suppose we say, part of a religious narrative and its moral valuation is going to be, say, commandments about honesty and not lying and so on. So part of the package of beliefs is be honest and don't lie. And we then will act upon that belief as if God has told us and as if God is, say, monitoring our behavior. So the pragmatic justification of that particular policy is not going to be, well, there's actually a God who actually told us that and is actually monitoring our behavior. The pragmatic justification of that policy is going to be something like, well, people who are honest, who are not liars, they do better psychologically and they do better socially than liars do. Now, suppose then we say, okay, well, that's interesting. And suppose, though, we go on as modern scientists and we gather all kinds of data and we find out, yeah, in fact, that claim is empirically supported. We can find, that honest people have better, say, friendships or romantic relationships, and they do better in business and so forth. But now what we have is this belief, be honest. It is now empirically validated. What more justification do we need at that point? What does act as though God told you to be honest add to it? We have all of the practical, empirical, scientific validation that we need, so we can, so to speak, jettison the original faith-held religious order. Here's an analogy. Suppose you're a kid. Your parent is teaching you about nutrition and habits of eating and so forth. And your parent might teach you as a child to eat vegetables. Now, at the beginning, your child's eating behavior, that might just be an authority or obedience claim. I eat as if my mother were watching over me. But you're a child, and then you start to grow up, and you start to actually learn some nutrition science, and you start to acquire lots of evidence of vegetables having practical, functional value. So now, as a mature person, right, you're eating vegetables, but you're eating them based on grasping their functional value. The fact that your mother might have earlier said to you, eat your vegetables, right, that just drops out of the justificatory story, right? You're not eating vegetables now because your mom told you, and you're eating as if your mom is still watching you. Rather, you're eating the vegetables on empirical, practical, scientifically validated awareness. So maybe even your mother has grown old and died, and it would be very odd at this point for the now adult talking about his or her eating habits to say, well, I eat as if my mom still exists. And the point then by analogy for religion is just as we might start off saying, I act as if God exists, and that's why I do certain moral kinds of behaviors. If in fact I can grow up and see for myself empirically that certain moral predictions are functionally useful, then I don't need the early religious mythic justification for it. Religion goes out the window, it seems.
In Stephen Hicks' newest book, Liberalism, Pro and Con, Dr. Hicks examines 15 arguments for liberalism and 15 against, in detail, and expands upon the significance of each. To get your copy of Liberalism, Pro and Con, click on the link in the description of this podcast or hop onto the web and search for your copy of Liberalism, Pro and Con. While you're online, please leave a review for the Open College podcast and follow us online on all of our social media platforms, Twitter, Parler, and Minds. Now back to the podcast.
Now, just as a kind of a concluding remark then, I do think this about Jordan Peterson, and this is somewhat speculative, but this is my sense. So what I want to suggest is that Jordan Peterson is a man of science. And I want to close by suggesting that his views are evolving, that they're evolving from a more traditional religion versus science duality onto a pragmatic functionalist account of religion, where the pragmatism is quite strong, but nonetheless nested within a kind of religion as a default position, to what now I think he's going in the direction of kind of an Aristotelian pragmatism. And I'll say a little bit more about the Aristotelian part in just a moment. But what I want to suggest here is that in Peterson's work, the science is slowly prevailing over the religion. Now, I think Jordan Peterson is a rational man, and he is a realist in practice. But in theory, he is a pragmatist. And I think that's for the usual reasons that devising an epistemological theory of truth and justification, that's very hard. And Peterson settles for a kind of pragmatic workability about theories, as many thoughtful people do. But in his thinking, that workability, pragmatic workability, is really ultimately a matter of empirically assessing facts, rationally assessing them. What actually works in practice in the real world. That's his bottom line. His evaluation of religious narratives is consistently in evolutionary and functional terms. He believes they are a set of myths that work. And they work because they capture, sometimes literally, sometimes metaphorically, they capture truths about human action in the world that science cannot express fully, or maybe not yet, and it expresses them in a way that pre-scientific people and even non-scientific people can grasp. But in his thinking, their workability is not a matter of timeless absolutes. The real world changes, so even the narratives that have worked for a long while are, in principle, in his thinking, subject to evolutionary revision. So I take very seriously Jordan Peterson's statement that for human beings, biological fundamentals are just that, fundamentals. Now note this very strong formulation, quote, "We are primarily concerned with the affective and emotional significance of the environment. Along with our animal cousins, we devote ourselves to fundamentals. Will this new thing eat me? Can I eat it? Will it chase me? Should I chase it? Can I mate with it?" End quote. That's from the 1999 Maps of Meaning. But notice what Peterson is saying here. He is saying that aggression, eating, sex are primary and fundamental. And if we push hard on those buttons, primary and fundamental, that makes biology basic in his thinking. He's first and foremost a scientist. Now, our big brains do generate psychological complexity. But science and religion, all of the theory stuff that goes on in our heads, those are ultimately functional values. We create theories, we create these narratives, maps, but they are evaluated in terms of their utility, and that utility is entirely determined by the biological consequences of action in a material environment. Now, to come back to Aristotle, to put some philosophical labeling terms, right, this interpretation of him is pushing him into territory that was first established by Aristotle about 2,400 years ago. So the great biologist philosopher, Aristotle, he grounded the good, the valuable, the meaningful, but in scientifically identifiable facts about the natural world. So what's good for animals, for dolphins, for hares, for barnacles, for any species, is their functioning according to their biological and sometimes psychological identities. Each species has a natural mode of living, and that includes human beings who flourish to the extent that they live according to their natures. Here's a quotation from Aristotle, quote, "We state the function of man to be a certain kind of life, and this to be an activity or actions of the soul, or psyche, implying a rational principle, and the function of a good man to be the good and noble performance of these." But notice what we have here is value terms like good and noble and so forth, tied directly to functional identity, action in the real world. So the point for Aristotle is that human beings are rational animals, and rationality's purpose is to identify these general principles and then to use them to form our virtues of characters, our habits of action in the world. As a result of that, we're not going to, it is not possible, as Aristotle argues, for us just as human beings to flourish in any sort of unprincipled, just do whatever you feel like way, just like a dolphin can't flourish in just anything it feels like kind of way, right? Or a hawk, or a fish, right? And so on. We have an identity, a set of functions, things that are built in good for us in terms of what our needs are and how we need to act in order to fulfill our needs. And at the same time, we are doing this in biological/scientific, naturalistic ways. We don't need to appeal to some sort of supernaturalistic or shadowy realms beyond nature to try to find goods and moral guidance. They're built into nature and human nature. Now, I think Peterson is moving in this direction. And a final question then arises about Jordan Peterson's kind of public intellectual advocacy of religion. So again, hypothetically, if the logic of his theory, his theoretical position is that religion is not true but useful, then is his publicly promoting it a socially useful fiction? That is to say, is his pragmatic religion and his endorsement of it a kind of noble lie? Now, Jordan Peterson, he's a very well-read man. He's a highly intelligent psychologist. He probably knows it's not true, and he himself abjures the truth labels. But this is taking him into the territory of Alexis de Tocqueville and Sigmund Freud, who also believed and knew, as highly intelligent, well-read individuals, that religion was not true. So is Peterson following them in urging that even so, it's better for the less intellectual masses to believe religion individually and socially? Now, I don't know, but I do suspect that this noble lie interpretation of Peterson is not true, and I base that on what seems to me very ruthless honesty consistently in his writings and in his public appearances. So I think the more likely interpretation is that Jordan Peterson is a genuine man of science and that he practices the virtues of science that he preaches. But what this means is that science, including the science of values, it's an evolving discipline. And it is for him a work in progress, just as for all of us, actually, it should be a work in progress. So he's calling it as he sees it now. Values and meaning, they are biologically, evolutionarily, and pragmatically based. And that includes a functional role for religious myth, both for us as individuals and as members of social communities. And that's the truth as best as Jordan Peterson can say now.
You've been listening to Open College with Dr. Stephen Hicks. Follow us on social media and visit opencollegepodcast.com for all Open College episodes and feed links. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave us a review or click subscribe on YouTube, Rumble, or Odyssey. For more on Dr. Hicks's work, please visit www.stephenhicks.org. For all our other podcasts, please visit our website at www.possiblycorrect.com.